Professor Dutton is a tenured professor at Connecticut College and a specialist in Japanese and in Korean history, modern history. She received her bachelor's at Columbia University in East Asian Studies, and also in geology. And I just learned this today, that she got interested in Japan, not because of history or politics, but because of geology. She wanted to study volcanoes. So, there are various ways to all end up in this place. Professor Dutton then went on to do her master's and doctoral studies at the University of Chicago, and just published a book, and you can maybe hold this up, in November 2004, entitled Japan's Colonization of Korea, Discourse and Power. And we will hear a little bit about this book today, and then also make the arch to present controversies that have to do with Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910. Professor Dutton has spent quite some time in both Japan and Korea, most recently 2003 to 4. She even taught at Seoul National University in Japanese, mind you, and researched in Japan, and is now currently working on a topic, apology and apologism between Japan, Korea, and the United States. So contemporary, a problem. So let's give her a hand. And a couple more things. I actually, for the class, printed out the readings for Wednesday, because WebCT had some problems over the weekend. If you could please pick up one of each before you go, that would be helpful. And then 3 weeks, oh, actually, I brought the wrong flyer, so never mind. 3 weeks from now, we'll have Spice Orga, the movie, in this lecture series.
Thank you very much, and thank you all, and thanks to Professor Serafim for having me here today. I'd like to just not engage in self-promotion of the book. I actually am using this image in about 10 minutes in the talk, so I'm going to start passing a jacket around in this side and the book in this side, just to familiarize yourselves with the image that we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. And before I start discussing legality and apology by way of a personal apology, which is not an apology but an explanation, I'm 5.5 months pregnant. I'll be doing a lot of sitting. And so just please bear with me for not running around the front of the room, which I usually do. It's a big anniversary year in Japanese-Korean relations. Have any of you studied what anniversaries 2005 bring? Anybody know? We've got a 40, a 60, and a 100. You should be able to get the 60.
It's the 60th anniversary of the end of World War II.
60th anniversary of the end of the war, which in Korea is known as Liberation Day. Liberation from the Japanese. What's it the 40th anniversary of? It's the 40th anniversary of normalized relations between Japan and South Korea alone, which is a very important thing that we'll come to. A decision made in international law in 1965, which has, since that time, effectively worked to legalize South Korea as the government on the Korean peninsula, which should strike you as interesting as future historians, because that condition did not exist until 1945, when there was just Korea, right? Right. 100-year anniversary, the big one.
Russo-Japanese War?
Yeah, the Russo-Japanese War, in which Japan won Korea. The Portsmouth Treaty, signed just a little north of here in 1905 and orchestrated by President Roosevelt, for which he won the second Nobel Peace Prize, effectively transferred Korea to Japan. There was a little trade-off. The United States got the Philippines and Hawaii. Which brings me to what I really want to talk about today is the importance of understanding both the politics of apology at the present moment, for which the past is compensated, as well as the politics of imperialism that launched the 20th century in an international history context. The colonization of Korea is not an event that took place only in Korea. It may not make a whole lot of sense yet, but I'll try and make it make sense in a little bit. Contemporary Japanese-Korean relations, as some of you may know very well, are particularly entwined in the issue of apology and reparations, and they remain in a long-standing debate about the very terms of colonization. When I say colonization, I mean roughly 1905 to 1945. And what I'd like to try and make clear today is that I see a similar problem mirroring 1965 to the present, the normalization era. That is true also for the sort of 1905 to 1910 era, in which the terms of imperializing Korea are done in an international context the same way that the terms of apologizing for colonizing, also known as normalizing, or you could call it decolonizing, are taking place in an international arena. The current problems of apology and reparations for the colonization era between Japan and Korea are probably more familiar to you than the actual history of the colonization era. Some of you may have heard of the problems of the so-called comfort women, the sex slaves the women forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese Imperial Army, forced conscripted soldiers, millions, arguably millions of forced slave laborers brought from Korea to Japan or other parts of the Japanese Empire during the 1930 to 1945 era of Japan's colonization of Korea. Always something to bear in mind is that while World War II, or Japan's war in Asia, was raging in lots of places around Korea, it actually wasn't being fought on Korea. Instead, Japan was eviscerating Korea of its people and resources for war effort. So that's something also to keep in mind. Now, what I'd like to do first is clarify by what I mean by the politics of apology at present, because I'm sure some of this is familiar to you all. Politics of apology can take various forms, and this is most recently from the Abu Ghraib scandal last spring. The Bush is looking for cards for apologies for torture, and the Al-Qaeda guy is standing there, and then down at the bottom I particularly like the problems of which word to use to apologize. This, at the level, could be seen as apology for the recent past. What interests me as a historian is, we can take it, you pretty much can see that, right? Okay, great. Is something that I like to think of as apology for the past. That's what I'm not sure right now. Apology for the past, an era in which most of the survivors are actually dead. And there are very few living testimonies around, and so we're dealing with this murky area in which law and history are colliding. To the extent that some people advocating for an apology wish to declare the past itself illegal, which is kind of difficult to do once it's happened. In all of this, as I think many people are familiar, Japan is perennially compared to Germany. Germany has apologized. Japan has not apologized. Like Professor Serafim, I find that a very problematic equation. I'm going to let her take that up with you in class and not dwell on it today. But in general, Japan stands as the international community's renegade, unapologetic country. I'd like to argue the opposite. I like to argue that Japan has apologized in international terms, but clearly the terms with which it has apologized have fallen far short of what victims of its imperial processing war effort find adequate or find meaningful. And so, to me, the more interesting way to approach this problem, and why I find it comparable to the politics of imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century, is to examine the international context which upholds certain practices of legal apology. 100 years earlier, certain practices of legal takeover. In South Korea at the moment, and some of you may have been following this in your own lives, the South Korean government in power is taking a very active stance on investigating the past, particularly the 1965 era, when normalization with Japan occurred, as well as the colonial era, in terms of which particular Koreans worked with the Japanese in colonizing Korea. This has, however, led to one of the sort of tricky problems that can happen when you investigate your own country's history. And I'm assuming you all read Korean for this cartoon, but I'll help you translate it. These people here are those who were victims of the Japanese Empire. Particularly, you're supposed to understand these two women as former sex slaves, this man probably as a forced laborer. You could understand him as a forced conscript soldier too, but they're representing the millions. This guy is a Japanese man who's done the negotiating between Japan and Korea in 1965. This cartoon came out last week, sorry. This man is Park Chung-hee, who was dictator of South Korea from 1961 to 1979, who had been an army officer in the Japanese Imperial Army in Manchuria, spoke fluent Japanese, and then under US patronage 20 years later became president for life of South Korea. And fortunately, there's a wonderful new movie out about his assassination in 1979, complete with the wild sex parties that were also part of it, but that, doesn't have subtitles yet. Anywho, coming from the voice of Japan, see, that can really be fun to do this. Coming from Japan these are instructions from Japan being interpreted by this man saying, we're paying individual compensation to the poor one, right? This being the president, who's about to run off with the $300 million aid package that has been, instead of being distributed to all these people seeking individual reparations for the war, the two governments have worked together. He said, but I only got 30 man won, which you're supposed to actually understand is he's only getting $300 million, which is a lot more than 30 man won, but he's just sort of saying, but I didn't get anything. In fact, it's been shown that Park Chung-hee and his government got the aid package, chose with the Japanese not to distribute it individually or come up with individual compensation packages to any of the victims. This one's also kind of nice. I won't stay a long time on it. Here's the Japanese official chucking the money over to Korea. Here are the victims again, particularly the sex slaves in the front, saying, okay, that's it. That does it for reparations. This man, a politician named Kim Jong-pil, jumping in above, grabbing it in his teeth. Both he and Park Chung-hee say, okay, economic development, here we go. That would bring you to one of those tiger miracle economies, South Korea. Okay. The other tricky part when you investigate the past is you find out that people on both teams, not just the dictators for life, but those accusing the dictators for life also participated. These came out in August when, isn't your Korean getting better? These came out in August when the decision to investigate the past began. This woman is Park Chung-hee's daughter, who is currently the head of the opposition party in South Korea. This, and everybody knows that she's the daughter of dictator for life, but somehow is ignoring this. This man is the head of the party in power, which you could call a left-leaning party, that is saying, okay, we're going to investigate the past, and he runs straight into the hoof of the horse that his father is riding, because it transpired within the first week of investigating the past that therefore the fathers of both the head politicians in the Korean parliament had participated in the Japanese army. So that was kind of problematic, and then both he and she are trying to hold back the past from coming out and telling the truth. And here we have a third generation independence activist lying impoverished off in the corner. So much for Korean political cartoons at the moment. Could I have the lights? But just to give you a sense that this is an ongoing mess in both of these countries, but particularly in Korea right now, which is trying to bring it out into the open, but revealing that everybody's involved, or everybody in power is involved. Let me be careful. So how did I come to be interested in all this present stuff? Because I am a historian, after all. I came to be interested about 6 years ago when I finished my dissertation, which became the book that's circling around the room. And I had very dutifully just finished 40 minutes of explaining how Japan's colonization of Korea was legal and so forth and so on. And somebody would ask a question relating to that, but then inevitably, invariably, and I must have given this talk 20, 30 times, someone would raise their hand and say, when is Japan going to apologize? And I think, I didn't talk about that, and I don't know anything about that, and I don't really have an opinion right now. And it then began to occur to me that by not even having thought about it, I didn't know what I had just written about in 1910. Because this is living history. The 1905 to 1910 to 1945 era remains living history. Whether the people are alive or not who suffered, the stories themselves in the suffering remain living history in these two countries. And it began to dawn on me that I really needed to consider it as sort of the politics of apology as a coda to the 20th century that began with the politics of imperialism. And what did that mean in the context of Japanese-Korean relations? So if you'll jump back 100 years with me to the 1905 moment, I'd like to speak a little bit about that. And most of you have seen the cover of the book by now? If not, just keep it going around, because I'd like you to think about that image. I'm sorry, I don't have something to put up for that yet. This is a color woodblock print done in 1894 by a Japanese artist named Kobayashi Kiyochika. Is there an extra copy that, like, for anybody who hasn't seen, you could just sort of stand up and give them a preview? It's the Japanese army invading Pyongyang in 1894 in the Sino-Japanese War. Thanks. And this is one of the final generation of war print artists. These are the guys who predated photographers or television cameras. And they would literally follow the army around and draw sketches of them attacking various battles that were going on. It's an art that died out effectively in this war. A few of them continued into the Russo-Japanese War, but photography really took over. I mention this because it's important to understand that the colonization of Korea between 1905 and 1910 took place in full view of the world and largely to the great applause of the so-called community of nations, the international powers, the great powers of the day. It took place in full view, particularly of the Japanese people at home who bought prints such as Kobayashi Kiyochika's war prints, numbering in print runs of 100,000. These were prints that appeared daily in the newspapers to advertise the success of Japan's colonization of Korea. These were not things like the Abu Ghraib scandal, for example, that they tried to hide. This was made for consumption. It was made for the extension of knowledge of Japan's victories at war. And pictures such as these recounted the success of Japan's efforts at colonizing Korea in particular. This first war, the 1894 to 95 war, which Japan won, is called the Sino-Japanese War. The second war, the Russo-Japanese War, it's very interesting that both of these wars took place on and around Korea, and Korea's name does not appear in the historical title of either of these wars. Japan won both of these wars. The first victory was significant in the Asia world because for the first time what had first been called by the Chinese historians the stumpy little midgets to the east won, and they beat the empire. And they beat the empire big. But the empire itself wasn't the really big empire. The really big empire was the white guys. And when they beat the Russians in 1905, that, as John Dower perfectly wrote, stunned the West. So the combination of first beating the Chinese, cemented by beating the Russians, showed that Japan was the new power in Asia. And what Japan did by becoming the new power in Asia was determine the terms of law with which Asia would conduct diplomacy. This isn't sort of, from a power politics standpoint, you could say, well, really, you had to win the war. Yeah, you had to win the war, but as we all know, winning the terms of peace means declaring the language of that peace. And Japan used a new terminology of power for the first time with regards to Korea. It declared Korea an independent nation in 1895. It declared Korea, therefore, independent from China. And so when in 1897 independence activists in Korea built a copy of the Arc de Triomphe in downtown Seoul, the Independence Arch, they were celebrating independence from China. In 1905, however, when Japan defeated Russia and was given Korea as war booty by the US, effectively, the Japanese celebrated their victory by declaring a protectorate over Korea. These were words in international law that had not existed in Chinese characters before, but were being used for the first time by the Japanese. In the 1870s and 1880s and early 1890s, when the Japanese tried to use these terms with regards to Korea with China, the Chinese said, well, those are fine if you want to talk to the English and the French and the Americans, but they don't have any history in the China world, and so it doesn't matter. After they beat China in 1895, the Chinese agreed to sign the treaties that guaranteed that Korea was an independent nation, an independent and sovereign nation. So while, yeah, you need the guns to win the war, when you're in a position to define law, you're also in an equal position of power. And I would argue that it's important to understand that for the entire 20th century, which seems like an enormously long period of time, but is actually minuscule in the history of Asia, this enormous change happened. For the 20th century, the Japanese have defined international relations in Asia. China uses these terms, Korea uses these terms, both North and South, Vietnam uses these terms. These are the terms with which to conduct international law, international relations of the 20th century. And so in and of themselves make it important to understand how the Japanese were positioning themselves. They weren't trying to impress the Chinese. Who would they be trying to impress by using words like protectorate, annexation? You said the Americans. Absolutely. We annexed Hawaii. Anybody else?
That's what I was going to say, or just the Western powers.
Okay, let's be specific. Who annexed Vietnam? The French. Who annexed Egypt? Okay, all of these words existed outside the Chinese character world. They found relevance in Europe. And that's what the Japanese were concerned with, was defining their project to those powers so that when the treaties that they used to colonize Korea were translated into English, which became the legal language of diplomacy for Asia in 1895, when those treaties were given to the diplomats at the ambassadors at the various embassies in Japanese occupied territories, they already made sense. They made sense in the language of imperialism, so that when they got translated back into the indigenous languages for the first time, Korean, for example, it was a whole new ballgame. People had to figure out what was happening to their political world around them. And the first step in colonization is, well, you could say it's a treaty of commerce, but arguably it's a protectorate. does anybody know what a protectorate is? What is it? What did the Japanese win in 1905 by gaining a protectorate over Korea? The Koreans still had an emperor. King Kojong still sat on the throne. But what could he not do? The United States, by the way, wanted to declare Bosnia a protectorate in 1994, but Clinton backed down. What does a protectorate prevent another nation from doing? You can't conduct foreign relations for yourself anymore. So the Koreans no longer existed to the rest of the world without Japanese chaperones, basically. The people of Korea were still there. They still had a country called Korea, as far as they were concerned. But as far as actually presenting themselves abroad, they could no longer do this. And sovereignty is a twofold concept in international law. You need external and internal. And external is really important. Does this sound familiar in our current problem in Iraq? I mean, does Iraq have external sovereignty right now? Right. So it's this kind of game that started in the early 20th century in Japanese-Korean relations. The Japanese took away Korea's ability to exist on an international stage. Not all Koreans sat down and said this was okay. Not at all. The king, for example, sent secret emissaries to the Court of International Law, which was not called the Court of International Law. It was the Conference on Peace at The Hague in the Netherlands. The second Conference on Peace at The Hague was held in the summer of 1907, and King Kojong of Korea sent 3 secret emissaries overland to declare Korea's independence and to say that Japan was taking over Korea illegally. Anybody know what happened to those 3 guys who managed to walk across Siberia and get all the way to Holland? They weren't allowed inside the building. Why? Because Japan was there to conduct Korea's international relations. So the 3 men didn't give up. They tried to get to the United States, and they got all the way to Washington to discover that Roosevelt was at his summer house on Long Island, and that it didn't really matter because Secretary of State Root said, but we don't recognize you because Japan controls your international relations. The previous winter in 1906, the US Congress had erased the category of Korea from the record of countries that the United States had negotiations with, and Korea became part of the Japan chapter. So let me talk a little bit about what this legal, illegal, legitimacy, illegitimacy stuff means, because it really does strike a chord when you walk down the street in Seoul and say, the Japanese legally colonized Korea. Because you could, somebody might try to shoot you or throw things at you. I have actually had people throw fruit at me for saying this in a university in Busan, but we ended up going out afterwards and making up. Let me be very specific by what I mean by legal. Colonization as political practice, economic practice, social practice was legal the way slavery was legal. Many legal scholars worried about whether it was a savory thing to do, and many people viewed it as unfortunate. Nonetheless, in the mid-19th century, many maintained that slavery was good for the slaves and that the emerging colonial powers were operating the Atlantic slave trade in accordance with international prevailing laws. Like the atmosphere, therefore, that was embracing the legality of slavery, the terrain that was under imperialism reveals how those who are in charge determined what was legal and protected that legality to uphold their self-interests. And so that's itself, to me, what makes the issue of the declarations, the treaties of takeover interesting, because of course, these are really boring documents. I mean, if you had to read anything like a big legal treaty declaring one country taking over another, you miss the whole story. You miss all of the individual tragedy or the individual victories of colonization. It is the dominator's story. At the same time, since these are the words that won the 20th century, I think it's important to consider what was meant at the time by independence and sovereignty as far as the Japanese were defining it, as far as annexation and protectorate was at the time, to understand what the definition was and what was being upheld by the international community as legal practice. No one protested the 1910 annexation of Korea. No one in power, that is. The Russians weren't pleased by it because they'd lost the war against the Japanese. In 1907, when those three guys got shut out of The Hague, one legal scholar in France wrote that he thought it was possible that the Japanese had invalidly signed the treaties of the protectorate. And there's no doubt they forced them, they forged them, they bribed officials. But even this one legal scholar in 1907 didn't question the validity of imperialism. He questioned whether the Japanese had actually signed the treaties correctly. And so it's important to understand that these individual pieces of paper giving one country to another counted as law and therefore counted as precedent and counted as the definition of power at the time for what happened. The question of legality of Japan's colonization of Korea, therefore, I think is important to see in light of the other annexations of the day, the one that you guys were mentioning. And what has arisen in the post-colonial present, meaning 1945 to the present, about the legality of these documents has a lot more to do with what actually happened as history. The forcible conscription of soldiers, the evisceration of natural resources, the 200,000 plus minus women as sex slaves, on the Korea side, as well as, and as important, because remember we're talking about two versions here, as well as Japan's own brutal defeat in 1945. I mean, there is a reason that the Japanese keep saying, well, this was totally fine. It's not because the Japanese as an entire population of people have decided not to learn anything, but it's a question of how to describe what happened. Since the collapse of Japan's empire in 1945, Japan and Korea's, and here I'm saying North and South Korea together for a second, Japan and Korea's respective stances on the question of the legality of the colonization have become core features of national self-definition. To put it simply, the general approach in Japan is that it was legal because the other nations at the time were doing this. However, if you leave the argument to rest simply that what Japan did was legal and therefore it was okay, it becomes a form of apologist history by writing away what actually happened. You can say, oh, it was fine because everybody else was doing it. Well, slavery in Brazil was fine because everybody else was doing it. Did you have a question?
I'm assuming that you're going to talk about the change in the name that occurred on the map.
The North and South Korea, we're getting it. But absolutely, in general, and this is an important point, because in general, Korea's stance, and here I mean North and South Korea, is that the Japanese colonization of Korea was wholly illegal and has no basis in memory as a legal event, and therefore the whole colonial era itself must be declared illegal. And your point is perfect here, because what has emerged in the 1990s is that this particular statement by both North and South Korean governments, the colonization of Korea was illegal, is the single sentence at unification talks between between North and South Korea that the two governments willingly agree on. And it is now a way of coming together as Koreans is to out-hate the Japanese. Again, I'm at the official level and I've participated in some of these talks, and it's astonishing because the North Korean side claims to have documents. The intricacies of this are wonderful. The Japanese burned as many documents as possible before leaving their colonial outpost in Seoul. And so for a long time, people said, oh, you can't do the history of the colonial era, there's nothing to read. Well, there's a lot to read. You just have to go outside some of the government sources. Fortunately, they didn't also burn all the government sources. There are a lot of government sources. But in Pyongyang, they pretty much left a lot of buildings intact, and a lot of the archives were put underground even during the bombing of Pyongyang in the Korean War. So the Koreans show up to the North Koreans show up to unification talks these days and say, we have documents. We can prove that the colonization of Korea was illegal. And the South Koreans will say, well, we know it was illegal. And it just becomes this cyclical argument of out-hating the Japanese. But it has very little to do with what actually happened in writing the treaties of takeover in 1905 and 1910, let alone what the international conditions of empire at the time were that afforded the international communities sanctioning of the takeover in 1910. But your point is also excellent, because why would these two countries be in agreement on this one particular issue? What's in it? What's really at stake from the Korean perspective, North and South? Is it just the money? Because a lot of people say they're just in it for the money. And at the moment, normalization talks between Pyongyang and Tokyo carry with them about a $10 billion price tag, which is $2,005 for the $600 million that happened in 1965. It's exactly the same equation of money. But what's in it for the Koreans? We'll come to it. Okay. Just think about that question, because I mean, if it's just the money, then the governments are just going to do what they did in 1965. So let's examine what, in fact, Japan has done. Because remember, I made that argument that should get things thrown at me that Japan has apologized. Why are these people still upset? Interestingly, almost as soon as the war ended in 1945, debates began in Japan with how to come to terms with the war, how to come to terms with Japan's aggression, what forms of compensation should Japan pay. Arguably, a lot of that came about at the time, not just because there was this giant feeling of guilt and remorse, but because Japan had legal scholars that had been actively aware of what international protocol for war was, which was, if you lost, you paid. Japan still hasn't paid the countries that it was most brutal to. And that's where, in the post-war, you can't study these questions without looking at the questions of the United States arrangements with these two countries and what the United States brokered as a peace deal. Why are China and Korea, North Korea in particular, the ones that still haven't received any compensation packages in the name of apology?
Cold War.
Cold War, which has always been hot in Asia, right? They are the communist states. They had gone communist by the time the United States brokered the 1952 San Francisco deal, which set up aid packages to Southeast Asian nations, but excluded Korea, which was at war at the time, and excluded China because it had gone communist at the time. Thus, the lingering issues set into stone in the largest peace treaty upheld by the United Nations at the time do in fact implicate the United States in questions of responsibility for this ongoing issue. Does that change the history of what happened in 1910? Not really, but the problem is you can't look at 1910 without looking at it through that wall. All right. There was an interesting moment in 1989. Emperor Hirohito, the wartime emperor, died. And his death coincided with a rise of democracy movements, particularly in South Korea. And these democracy movements that were taking place in the regions of Japan's former empire were precisely the ones that were bringing new voices to light within their own governments. Within Japan, it became possible to talk about a war and the man in charge of that war in a way that had not been publicly possible until his death. And so the combined factor of these two moments ushered in what I like to think of the 1990s as a decade of apology, or the apology decade, which I think we can safely say has ended about arguably a month ago when the Supreme Court of Japan decided finally after 13 years that a case made by former sex slaves against the Japanese government had no validity in Japan because the events happened before the 1947 Constitution was written, and therefore it was a different country that was responsible for it. So we can sort of assume that apology's over. And yet, what happened in that combined also, however, I mean, what happens in the 1990s? The 1990s are also a decade when Japan's so-called miracle economy nosedives. And at the same time, there became a fixation among many Japanese to become a normal state. And they were it was called normaru. And they're defining normal as a state with both a permanent UN Security Council seat and a proactive military. And these are two very expensive things to maintain while your economy is heading south. One way of defining Japan as a normal state was to engage in what was happening around the world, which was an international movement of apology politics. It was not just Japan. Arguably, it started in Germany. You could locate it in 1985 with statements about the country's former Nazi crimes. But it's a movement that took off, and there are several really interesting books about this that compare apology movements around the world in the 1990s. But there were days in the 1990s when Queen Elizabeth and the Pope would both apologize on behalf of their countries for past wrongs, when the President of the United States would apologize for Japanese-American incarceration during the Second World War, when the past came to light and was spoken about in what I like to call a discourse of sorrow and regret, the terms that made it possible for states to speak about the past and bring the past to light. Am I at the 40-minute mark there?
Yeah, if we could
Okay.
transition into some question and answers.
Could I show one more?
The class at least has worked out some questions.
Excellent. Can I show one more thingy for the board? Okay. You're lucky. You're skipping your one Japanese lesson, but you're getting another one. And what this is a document that surprisingly surfaced in 2003. Because again, if the 1990s were this decade of apology movements in which people claiming that they had been wronged by the Japanese and the process of the Japanese war and empire had been clamoring right and left, give us an apology now, we are owed an apology. Who are they owed an apology by? Primarily, many of them came to the conclusion they wanted an apology from the man who had been in charge, Emperor Hirohito. And again, bear in mind, the man was dead, but that's not what mattered. It was knowing that their lives had mattered while they had lived them. And so some form of apology from the imperial household, a relative of Hirohito, was going to be good enough. Magically, in the summer of 2003, a document was found that Emperor Hirohito had apologized. And this became widely publicized in Japan in July 2003. Emperor Hirohito's sorrow for the war. But what's wonderful about that is this little sentence here, in which he apologizes to those who lost property abroad. Who are those people? They're Japanese. So this is Emperor Hirohito's apology to Japanese who suffered in the war and lost their property. But it's being interpreted domestically in Japan as, well, it's over. Hirohito already apologized. And you can see the gap that's set up in just this one little document of the past that continues into the present. So I'll shut up now and happily take questions.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. This was really, I think, really pulled some things together that we had started, actually, as a class. I think you have some questions. I mean, this is everybody, not just students in the class. And what would you like to ask as the W? Who has questions?
I'm happy to discuss the World Cup. It's an excellent question. I do believe at least one or two people in your speaker series are going to be able to address Indonesia pretty well, and I'm not dissing the question. Relations, views of Japan in general, and this is a gross overstatement, from Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, are much more positive than Korea and China, largely because of the massive economic assistance that came in the early 1950s from Japan. In addition to that, what makes the Southeast Asian nations a different category from Korea and Japan in terms of the pre-1945 colonists? Was it just Japan colonizing Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines? You had all the others. You had England. I mean, Vietnam's weird because the Japanese kept the French in charge while the Japanese were technically in charge, but they recognized that the French had the colonial situation pretty well under control, so they let the French continue in their positions of power, which sort of makes the Allied Axis alliance really weird in Vietnam. But the Japanese were first seen as liberators in those regions in 1941, liberating those regions from the white powers that had been colonizing them. Of course, then the brutality began. Then the women in those regions, for example, were used as sex slaves. Then the men were conscripted, forced into the Japanese Imperial Army. But then, in 1945, in many of those regions, the former colonial overlords came back because the Allies won. So the Dutch tried to set up shop again in Indonesia. And the memories of the Japanese, oh, well, they weren't as bad as these, because the Dutch came back and they weren't the same as they'd been before the war. So it's an excellent question, and it's not that it's more complicated than Korea and China, but Korea and China was easy. The Japanese had colonized them. The Japanese had killed 20 million Chinese. Knowing who your enemy was far clearer, and the fact that the enemy was getting off the hook, the Japanese, as far as the Chinese and the Koreans were concerned, was mind-boggling. Whereas in the Philippines and Indonesia and other Southeast Asian nations, there was this double colonization that had happened, and then nation-states had to be created. But it's an excellent point to think.
I have a question, but I really want you guys to get rid of yours.
You said that North and South Korea unite. One of their biggest or their only uniting things is their hatred of the Japanese.
On the official level.
On the official level, on the official and on kind of the just like normal population level, do Koreans and Chinese unite against their hatred of Japanese?
No. That's an excellent question. No. And what I do want to underscore is that while there is an official South Korean stance of antipathy towards the Japanese, there's enormous exchange between these two countries, cultural, economic, political. These are the two, I mean, South Korea's most important trading partner is, it's now possibly becoming China, but Japan is what is on the radar for South Koreans. South Korean music, Japanese music, Japanese movies, Japanese magazines have been enormously popular art forms for the last 20 years. They've been illegal for much of this time, but that doesn't mean that even without an internet, South Korean kids haven't figured out how to get music imported from Japan. What has happened this past year, the star of a really horrible television program called Winter Sonata, this man, a South Korean actor whose TV program wasn't really that hot in South Korea but got played on NHK, the national television station in Japan, just took over the Japanese, particularly female housewife consciousness, to the extent that it was impossible to get a ticket on a major airlines between Japan and South Korea during the winter holiday because a record number of Japanese were traveling to South Korea to find out where this TV program had been filmed. I'll pass this around because it's pretty interesting just to take a look at it. But what this means is there's all this sort of cultural level exchange that's been going on unofficially. Your question's really good because in 1998, there was an official first joint declaration by heads of state between South Korea and Japan to overcome the past and sort of ignore history, and they launched what was called an era of cultural sharing. So there's an official cultural exchange thing going on right now, and this year, the 40th anniversary of normalized relations, is officially the anniversary year of friendship, of cultural friendship. But again, this is all at the official level. North Korea is trickier in this problem, and in the last 2 years, North Korea has become public enemy number 1 as far as the Japanese government and population is concerned with the issue of the kidnapped Japanese to North Korea. To the extent that on Wednesday, when the North Korean soccer team plays its World Cup challenge match at the Saitama Stadium, there are more police on hand for this event already than there were at the entirety of World Cup in 2002. They are the Japanese state is terrified that someone's going to try and start shooting the North Korean soccer players. There is no cultural level of exchange between. China and Japan have enormously important ties despite the official antagonism. I mean, the number 1 economy, the booming economy that everyone's fearing, of course the Japanese are participating in. What is the real problem as far as the Chinese are concerned, even more than as far as the South Koreans are concerned, are the Prime Minister of Japan's visits to the shrine to war dead, Yasukuni. And to the extent that these are preventing official ties from going forward. Why can't South Korea and China come together and ask for reparations together is an excellent question. And on the one hand, I don't have an answer. On the other hand, I've seen some of these movements in action when the Chinese and the Koreans, both North and South, get together when they were at, for example, the tribunal. There was a people's tribunal held in the winter of December 2000 on behalf of the former sex slaves to hold the Japanese government accountable for war crimes against humanity. It was noticeable that the governments couldn't participate together. Why? I bet you can answer your own question. What's in it for them not to come together? Well, cash. Not really. They're not getting any money out of the People's Tribunal, for example. That was a tribunal on which the past was on trial. What is at the, I mentioned it a little bit, that the core of post-war definition, both Japan and South Korea, about the 1905-1910 treaties is the legality issue. But the core national definitions of a lot of these countries have to do with views on Japan during the war. What do you think the Chinese government gets out of not really examining the history of what happened? I mean, what can the Chinese do with the rape of Nanjing? I'm not asking you to excuse the rape of Nanjing, yeah.
When's it allowed them to just leave innocent victims?
When?
When it sort of allowed the innocence, sort of how you're talking about, like, if you examine history.
Yeah, but let's think post-war China. Let's think post-1945 China.
Like, gives them a rallying point.
A rallying point? What? Yeah.
It also might excuse some of the atrocities.
Ah, yeah, there was no cultural revolution. It was the Japan. Japan was bastards. And I mean that's what this has become. This is not history. This is the politics of blame. But what's fascinating is that it's the category of history that's getting used as the object, which is why it's particularly dicey to be a historian who actually likes to read the documents and suggest that, ooh, everybody was bad.
My question, do you have one? I have one, but when are you going?
No, I can.
There's one right there too.
Yes. Go back to the 1905, 1910, when what was legal then, what was considered legal then. Sometime after 1910, the term chosen
Yeah.
appeared on the maps, which is a Japanese thing.
Mm-hmm.
Japanese thing. It takes Korea out. Egypt never was taken out. Anglo-Egyptian Sudan was not taken out. And those protected. Why? What enabled Japan to do that?
they were actually Japanizing the Korean name Choson, which had been the dynasty name from 1392 to 1910 that Japan had conducted relations, but it actually, we like to say 1910 and then say, well, then the Japanese turned it into Chosen. But what happened in 1897 was that a group of independence activists in Korea convinced what had been a king in Korea, King Kojong, to compete internationally for Korea and rename Korea Taehanminguk, not Minguk, that's the current one, Taehan-chaeguk. And so the Koreans had renamed their own country in 1897 and renamed their king and emperor to declare Korea equal to China and Japan on the world stage. So the Japanese actually were erasing Korea's name, Taehan-chaeguk, and they turned it back into the old tributary name, Chosen. I didn't realize that's what you meant by names earlier, I apologize.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the San Francisco Treaty and the reparations, because I kind of got confused. I was under the impression that no one got reparations, because I thought that maybe South Korea might have gotten them because they were technically a republic, and that China and North Korea wouldn't have gotten them because the U.S. didn't recognize them, and the U.S. was in charge of this whole treaty. So if you could just clarify my confusion.
I'll start with an apology. I'm still studying this. No, South Korea did not get recognized. The Koreans and the Chinese were not allowed to sign the document.
Okay.
The Southeast Asian nations were allowed to sign the document. They were already under the wing on our side, as it were. And this is the largest, one of the largest sticking points and why it's vital to understand the United States' role in sustaining this mess, to the extent that it was an entirely U.S. decision to keep those countries out of the peace treaty in San Francisco. Obviously, both the Chinese and the Koreans, but especially the Chinese, who were already in the United Nations, right? They thought they should be there. But the peace that got brokered ignored where the war had happened in Asia and focused again on where the war had happened against the United States and the British. And at the moment, I'm working in the John Foster Dulles papers, and it's really clear his determination to keep out those nations. But what's equally clear, the Treaty of Versailles. Does anybody know what some of the problems with the Treaty of Versailles ending World War I are argued to have been? I'm sorry, yeah? Exactly. The Treaty of Versailles, orchestrated by the League of Nations, blamed the entirety of World War I on Germany and largely emptied German coffers of money, of state money. And so many have argued that the ease with which the Nazi Party came to power was the fault of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, that it was too much, and that Hitler was able to take advantage of this and come to power, and everybody was broke. John Foster Dulles had been a young man at that treaty signing, and he was determined, and his papers are fascinating. If you guys are looking for something, go to Princeton for a history degree. There are tons of papers. He's determined as a young man not to let this happen again, and when he finds himself as Secretary of State in charge of brokering the terms of Japan's defeat, he is determined to prevent another Treaty of Versailles, and he just wants to get it over with, and he doesn't want them to have to pay. And so what Japan actually paid the Southeast Asian nations was redefined not as apology money, but as economic development, creating the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And so it's all been done in the name of development rather than actually atoning for the past.
I think this San Francisco Treaty bit is fabulously interesting. But there isn't a whole lot of historical writing available on Korean-Japanese relations during the war, actually. Anybody of you is interested in this? This would be the scholarly approach to take. I can only advertise it and solicit your scholarly interest here.
and if you're even thinking about it as an undergraduate, there's really plenty in English. You know, for example, there's a postage stamp issued by the United States government in 1943 talking about future nations of the world, and one of them is Korea, up there with Poland, which is kind of interesting since in 1906 no one in Washington had a problem erasing Korea as a category. But I've never read a history of the postage stamp of that. I mean, it was, you know.
Do you still have time or no?
Actually, we can talk a little
Or-
bit. Is there
No, I thought one thing that might be interesting here to bring up, which
Yeah.
people might find interesting, because you touched on it in the beginning, these figures of the individual, individual victims, and about how the decade of apology was also a decade in which the voices of individual victims not only rising against Japan, but also critiquing their own governments was such a really another interesting factor. And so you've given us a lot in terms of state-to-state level. I thought you might just say something about how the activism of individuals, which resulted in things like the tribunal or NGOs or that kind of non-state actors, have been really important in transforming.
The individual is what is changing these politics, absolutely. For example, the decision this year in South Korea to investigate South Korea's history, it's not like everybody didn't know Park Chung-hee had worked for the Japanese. It's not like everybody was unaware that this guy should have been considered a traitor, but ran the country for 20 years and is described in many South Korean textbooks as the great leader who developed the country economically. It's not like people didn't know that, but as Professor O'Brien is saying, the space to tell this story really could only come about with the success of, in South Korea's case, the student movements, the pro-democracy movements that ultimately toppled Chun Doo-hwan especially, and brought about a 1990s in Seoul in which democratically elected people are president. The current guy in charge, Roh Moo-hyun, on the one hand is unfortunately as politically savvy as the president of Brazil at the moment, Lula, just doesn't really have it. On the other hand, no matter what you think of this guy, he is arguably South Korea's first really democratically elected politician. There was even a recount, and he won. I mean, imagine if we tried that here. I mean, a real recount, like every vote recounted. He won. They couldn't have done this in South Korea until this election. What was more amazing about the election of the current guy is that he came to power not because of anti-Americanism, as every American paper reported. He came to power because his basic party line was that the education system of South Korea needed reform, and that kids from lower and middle income families should be allowed to have access to good schools and go to a good university in a country in which it is still possible to operate on the basis of your family name. And Roh Moo-hyun is a nobody. He didn't go to Seoul National University. He didn't have a law degree. He passed the bar on his own. And this just totally topples the idea of what South Korea is. So he got into power, and the guys who put him into power are the activists, the well-known activists from the student democracy movements. So his cabinet, individuals making up his cabinet, are people that largely were in jail for the 1970s and 80s, which is also comparable to the current president of Brazil, Lula. So he's got this cabinet of people who were tortured by previous regimes. So the first thing they want to do, they want to continue their education policies, but what they really want to do is get those guys. So what they're doing is saying, let's open the archives. Let's let people read who made deals. And that's where the individual at the top level, and we need to take it down and look at the local level activism as well. But what's also interesting about the 1990s into now is that it's even at the top level where individual actors really matter, and especially in the South Korea case. We'll see about the future of China.
Well, thank you so much. This was wonderful.